Okay, so you've asked, I'm just going to repeat the question for the sake of audio in case the question wasn't heard. So the question was why the Orpheus and Eurydice myth is popular in Brazil. And the way I would go about answering this is to think more broadly about the role of the Orpheus myth in the early 20th century. That is, mythology in general in the early 20th century is being used as a kind of way of coping with modernity. So it's a modernist trope to go back to classical myths and see how we can set these myths up in a new context. That's something that we see going on a lot in the early 20th century. If you think of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, for example, you and I have worked a lot and talked a lot about things like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, 1952, all of which, all these mythology, poetry, novels, they're using modernist tropes through the classics. So I would say the question more broadly is what's going on with the use of classics in the early 20th century? Not just in Brazil, but in North America, in Europe, globally, in a way. Now, when it comes to Orpheus per se, Charles Siegel, the Harvard University classicist, who has a monograph on Orpheus, has argued that Orpheus in the early 20th century becomes a way of dealing with, particularly after 1945, World War II and the devastation that World War II caused. Even after World War I, you get Freud writing texts like Civilization and Its Discontents to think about how it is that in the modern world one could have such global devastation as a world war. Given all we know, given all we've been through, how could we still be doing this? And the same question arises after World War II in an even more profound and poignant way, because not only were we dealing with World War, but we've got people who are committing genocide, who are so cruel as to seek out the destruction of an entire race of people. So Orpheus is a myth about failure, in a way. It's a myth about the hero's inability to achieve the ultimate goals of heroism. We've got the notion in some cases of the Orpheus myth as a contrast or a direct opposition to the Odyssey. So if Odysseus is a hero of success, Orpheus is a hero of failure. Right? So the whole idea, of course, you've got Orpheus journeying into the underworld. He's got this great love for Eurydice. Eurydice dies. If you go by the Virgil myth, she dies because she's been bitten by a snake as she's out playing in the grove of Aristaeus. She dies. Orpheus is told that if he goes into the underworld, if he doesn't look at her, he'll be able to bring her back. He gets this because even Hades and Persephone are enamored of him. His song is so profound, so wonderful. We hear that the rocks cry out and dogs and wild beasts are tamed. So he gets to journey. That's the first part of the story. But he gets there and we don't know why. Virgil gives us no reason. Ovid says that perhaps he was too excited, so that he looks back in that moment, and in that moment he loses her. Well, that's a myth about failure. It's a myth about a hero's inability, despite all his potential, to tame, to control, to order his song. So you've got Charles Siegel talking about all these deployments of the Orpheus myth in the early 20th century. You've got Cocteau, what is that, 1950, 1949?
Yeah, 49, I think.
1949. You've got Tennessee Williams, Orpheus Rising or something like this, Orpheus Ascending. I forget the exact title of the Tennessee Williams play, but there's a Tennessee Williams play on the Orpheus myth. Do you remember?
Rising
Or Orpheus Arising or something like this, exactly. But again, time and time again, and what Siegel points out is that always in these myths you have, he says, it's a wonderful quote, he said you have trains, you have cars, you have all this transport, all these marks of modernity, these marks of the early 20th century. But he says you're going nowhere, right? All this travel back and forth, but in the end going nowhere. It's the opposite of the Odyssey. So if you look at the Cocteau, movie, Hermes is a chauffeur.
Yeah.
Likewise, in the Black Orpheus film, you've got Hermes as the train conductor, right? He's driving the streetcar. He's conducting the streetcar, Orpheus works with, he's on the car, he's on the bus or the train car at some point as well. So the Brazilians take this on board, right? They take it on as part of a way of dialoguing, discoursing with modernity. In 1922, there is what's called the Semana de Arte Moderna, the Week of Modern Art, in São Paulo in 1922. And we get Oswaldo de Andrade, wonderful Brazilian modernist poet, saying that the task of modernity in Brazil is to consume the products of the world, the art of the world, and to turn it into something that's unique, that's its own. This was his way. He says that this is a sort of homophagia, a kind of eating of human flesh, cannibalism.
Yeah.
And this was a trope that early writers in Brazil used to talk about the native culture, the way that the Indians consumed their opponents to gain their strength. You were going to ask something. You were going to say something.
Oh, I was just thinking 1922 because it's the famous modernist year of Ulysses coming out, and I think the way found out that year. But with Joyce's coming out the same year, I guess he's doing exactly the same thing to take what he wants from the Odyssey and make it his own and make himself an Irish.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that it was the same year. For the audio, Justine is saying that this is the same year as the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses. So this is an interesting year. Anything else about this particular issue, the Orpheus myth in Brazil? Also, there's another thing that's going on, very interestingly. In about 1955, Claude Lévi-Strauss travels to Brazil.
Yeah.
Actually, it might be a little bit earlier. And he publishes Tristes Tropiques. And he's got these quotes in Tristes Tropiques about his observations of the favela, the hillside ghettos in Brazil. And he talks about Negroes in these favelas playing their lively guitar melodies. This somehow struck him. I think actually also Orson Welles went to film in Brazil. I don't think the film was ever published, but he went, and some of the crew talked about the presence of blacks on the hillside dancing. It reminded them, they said, of a Greek chorus. The dancing sambistas, the blacks in the ghetto, in the favela, dancing sambas, reminded them of Greek choruses. So for those reasons, you've got, on the one hand, again, modernity worldwide, and then in Brazil specifically, a kind of local take on modernity.